Long before Susan Bailey's home became a crime scene, she had already given up one version of her future to build a safer one for her children. That is one of the cruelest parts of this case. The sacrifices Susan made for Jennifer and David would eventually be turned against her. The hours she worked to keep them secure became proof, in their minds, that she was never around. The rules she set because money was tight became proof that she wanted to control them. And her concern about the people entering their lives became something even darker, an obstacle that had to be removed. But that came later. In 2008, Susan Bailey was 43 years old and living in Roanoke, Texas. She had long, straight hair that fell somewhere between blonde and brunette, and the people who knew her remembered her as warm, sociable, and generally happy. Roanoke was not the place Susan had once imagined ending up. It was not her dream destination. Still, at that point in her life, it offered something more important than glamour or excitement. It worked for her children. Susan was raising 2 teenagers as a single mother. Her daughter, Jennifer, was 17. Her son, David, was 13. Their home sat on a street filled with families, the kind of neighborhood where children could find other children within a few doors of their own. Directly across the street was a large park. When Jennifer and David were younger, they could run over, play, and make friends without Susan having to drive them across town. Think about the decision behind that. Susan may not have loved Texas, but the house gave her children a neighborhood. It gave them space. It gave them a park across the street and other families close by. Sometimes, that is what parenting looks like. You let go of the place you would choose for yourself because another place works better for the people depending on you. And Susan had already spent much of her life searching for somewhere that felt right. She grew up outside St. Paul, Minnesota, in a small community where people tended to know one another. It was quiet, familiar, and by most measures safe. But it also came with Minnesota winters, and Susan eventually reached her limit. During the mid-1980s, when she was in her early 20s, a succession of severe snowstorms hit the state. They came one after another, leaving the roads so dangerous that getting to work became practically impossible. People could not make their normal commutes. Daily life stalled beneath snow and ice. For Susan, that stretch of weather settled the question. She told her parents she was finished with the snow, finished with the ice, finished with the cold. Before another winter arrived, she intended to be living somewhere warm, and she followed through. Within the next year, Susan left Minnesota and moved to Riverside, California, east of Los Angeles and inland from Orange County. It was far enough from Los Angeles to have its own identity, but close enough that the city remained accessible. More importantly for Susan, the climate was almost the complete opposite of what she had left behind. No brutal Minnesota winter. No repeated storms making the roads impassable. No months of living around snow and ice. Susan loved it. Although she had been born and raised in the Midwest, California seemed to fit her personality better. She embraced the sunshine and the year-round warmth. She liked having a place of her own and the independence that came with being far from her parents. She also developed a reputation for wearing bright colors, especially pink. Often enough that relatives associated it with her cheerful personality. You can picture her there. A young woman who had decided she wanted a different life, then crossed the country and created one. California also introduced Susan to Richard Bailey. Richard was a California native. He was short, dark-haired, good-looking, and carried himself with a casual confidence that Susan found appealing. He also seemed to have little interest in authority outside the structure required by his job, which was an interesting contradiction because he was serving in the United States Air Force. Susan's parents were not impressed. When Richard spent time with them, they found him rude and disrespectful. They believed he did not show them the consideration they expected from the man dating their daughter. Their view was straightforward. Susan could do better. Susan disagreed. She and Richard did not date for long before deciding they were in love. In the spring of 1988, they eloped. Whether her parents' disapproval directly influenced that choice is unclear, but they had made their feelings known, and Susan married him anyway. That detail matters. Years later, Susan would become the disapproving parent, watching her own daughter commit more deeply to a boyfriend every time Susan tried to pull them apart. But in 1988, Susan was the daughter convinced that her parents did not understand the man she loved. Marriage to Richard came with a life Susan could not fully control. Military families often receive orders that determine where they will live and when they will move. One assignment ends, another begins, and the entire household has to follow. That became the rhythm of the Bailey family. They moved from one posting to another, repeatedly packing their lives and starting again. New base, new town, new home. Then another set of orders and another relocation. Whatever stability Susan had hoped to create in California kept being interrupted by the demands of Richard's service. Even after Richard left the Air Force, military life did not disappear. He later served in the Coast Guard, extending the family's connection to that cycle of assignments, relocations, and constant adjustment. Along the way, Susan and Richard had 2 children. Jennifer was born in 1990. As a child, she was intelligent, artistic, and bookish. She liked to sketch for fun. She read constantly. She did well in school and had a close relationship with Susan. Jennifer was not the child people expected to cause serious problems. She rarely got into trouble and seemed comfortable operating independently. She was something of a loner, but not necessarily an unhappy one. She was not known for chasing popularity, going to parties, or trying to force herself into the center of a social group. For most of high school, she did not even date. She appeared content with books, art, and her own company. 5 years after Jennifer's birth, Susan and Richard welcomed David. He adored his older sister and copied many of her interests. Jennifer liked drawing, so David drew. Jennifer read, so David read. He visited the library constantly, finishing one book and immediately looking for the next. From the outside, they looked like quiet, creative siblings. Jennifer was the older sister David admired, and David was the younger brother who wanted to follow her lead. Eventually, the family tried to leave the constant movement behind and establish permanent roots in Texas. They settled in Roanoke, in that house across from the park. After years of military relocations, this was supposed to be somewhere they could stay. But putting down roots did not repair what was happening inside the marriage. By 2006, Susan and Richard had been married for 18 years, and the relationship was collapsing. One of the major sources of tension was money. According to the account given in the case, Richard had not maintained regular employment for years. He was home while Susan worked and carried the burden of supporting the household. That kind of imbalance does not stay confined to a bank statement. It follows people into every argument, every bill, every purchase, every hour one person spends at work while the other remains at home. Susan and Richard divorced in 2006. Susan kept custody of Jennifer and David, while Richard was expected to contribute child support. But child support did not remove the financial pressure. Susan worked in retail, an industry known for demanding hours without offering especially large paychecks. To keep the house running and support 2 children, she had to work long shifts and keep taking whatever hours were available. This is where the emotional logic of the Bailey home began to twist. Susan worked because her children needed food, clothing, utilities, phones, and a roof over their heads. Jennifer and David experienced those same working hours as absence. Their mother was rarely home. She was tired. Money still had to be watched. They did not have every comfort or luxury they wanted. And instead of seeing the work as something Susan was doing for them, they began treating it as something she was doing to them. Now, teenagers do not always see the full financial picture. Most of us can look back at that age and remember moments when we were selfish, entitled, or completely oblivious to what adults were carrying. But in this family, the strain was not hidden. Jennifer and David knew money was tight. They knew Susan was working to keep the household afloat. Their behavior still made that burden heavier. The family shared a cell phone plan at a time when those plans placed strict limits on minutes, text messages, and data. Going over the allowance did not mean a small inconvenience. It meant extra charges, sometimes enormous ones. Jennifer began calling and texting people constantly. David repeatedly used more internet data than the plan allowed. In a single month, they pushed the family's cell phone bill to approximately $1,500. Pause on that number. $1,500 was not simply an annoying bill for a household already under pressure. It was a financial emergency. Susan was a single mother working retail hours to support 2 children, and 1 month of excessive phone use created a bill that could rival rent or a mortgage payment. Jennifer was also overdrawing her checking account. Each purchase made without enough money triggered another overdraft charge, turning small transactions into larger losses. Yet there seemed to be little effort to change course or reduce the costs Susan had to absorb. The contradiction kept feeding itself. The children wanted Susan home more often. Their spending forced her to work more. The more she worked, the less present she could be. And the less present she was, the more they resented her. That does not explain what eventually happened, and it certainly does not excuse it. Plenty of teenagers experience divorce. Plenty feel ignored, angry, or restricted. They do not conspire to kill a parent. But this was the grievance taking shape inside the Bailey home. Susan believed she was doing what had to be done. Jennifer and David increasingly saw a mother who was absent, exhausted, worried about money, and always telling them what the family could not afford. The divorce had not simply divided the household. It had created a cycle. Susan's attempts to provide for Jennifer and David made her less available to them, and her absence became one of the things they held against her. Then Jennifer met someone who offered a completely different explanation for every restriction in her life. The problem was not money, divorce, or adolescence. According to him, the problem was anyone who tried to keep them apart. Paul Henson did not ask Jennifer to accept an ordinary act of infidelity. He told her that another personality, an executioner supposedly reincarnated from the 1700s, was dating the other girl. And somehow, that explanation worked. But before Talos, before the claims about reincarnation, and before 3 teenagers built a private world that seemed to operate by its own rules, Paul was Jennifer's new boyfriend. He was 16, 1 year younger than her, and attended the same high school. Paul lived outside Roanoke in a trailer with his father, Paul Henson Sr. His parents were divorced, and he had very little contact with his mother. Jennifer understood that kind of absence. Since Susan and Richard had separated, Jennifer had not seen much of her father either. That gave Jennifer and Paul something immediate to bond over. Both could say that one parent had largely disappeared from daily life. Both could talk about adults who had broken up their families. And both were old enough to resent those adults while still being young enough to depend on them for nearly everything. Even seeing each other required effort. Their homes were too far apart to reach comfortably on foot, and neither teenager had independent transportation. So they used bicycles. Paul would ride to Jennifer's house, or Jennifer would ride out to his trailer. It was a small detail, but it mattered. Their relationship developed around distance, limited freedom, and the constant need to work around their parents. Susan disliked Paul almost immediately. Some of that was his presentation. He wore dark clothes, listened to punk and hardcore music, and cultivated an image that was mysterious and unconventional. But Susan's concern went beyond the normal discomfort a parent might feel about a teenager's clothes or music. Something about Paul's behavior unsettled her. She found him strange in a way she could not easily define. And then there was Jennifer's reaction to him. For most of high school, Jennifer had been quiet and independent. She read. She sketched. She stayed out of trouble. She had never seemed desperate to become popular, attend parties, or organize her life around dating. Now, suddenly, Paul was becoming the center of everything. Jennifer was 17 and approaching graduation. College acceptance letters were arriving at the house. She had choices ahead of her, real choices about where she might go and what kind of adult life she wanted to build. Susan believed her daughter should have been looking forward. Instead, Jennifer seemed willing to let a 16-year-old boyfriend determine what happened next. That scared Susan. She worried that Jennifer was moving too fast and giving the relationship far more importance than it could safely carry. So she told her daughter exactly what she thought. Paul was bad news. Jennifer needed distance from him. She needed to think about college and stop allowing this relationship to crowd out everything else. But there was an irony here that Susan may have recognized better than anyone. When Susan was young, her own parents had disliked Richard Bailey. They thought he was rude and disrespectful. They believed their daughter could do better. Their resistance had not changed Susan's mind. If anything, it may have strengthened her determination. Susan married Richard anyway. Years later, she found herself standing on the other side of that same argument. The more Susan objected to Paul, the more tightly Jennifer held on to him. Every restriction could be interpreted as another reason to protect the relationship. Every warning became proof that Susan did not understand, and every attempt to create distance seemed to make Jennifer more committed. Then Marilee White entered the picture. Marilee was 14, a freshman at the same school. Her identity was protected in some early reporting, and several accounts used Marilee as a substitute name. It is the name by which she became publicly associated with the case. She looked up to Paul. He was older, dark, and unusual. To a younger teenager, those qualities could look less like warning signs and more like depth. He seemed mysterious, different, maybe even more mature than the other boys around her. Paul began spending more time with Marilee. Eventually, he told her they should date. Marilee knew he already had a girlfriend. Paul knew it too. Jennifer was not some distant or casual relationship he could pretend had already ended. But Paul did not hide what he was doing. He and Marilee told Jennifer about the second relationship. You might expect that to end things immediately. Instead, Paul offered an explanation designed to make the contradiction disappear. He said he had another personality named Talos. Paul, he insisted, remained committed to Jennifer. Talos was the one who loved Marilee. So, according to him, he was not one boy dating two girls. He was supposedly two separate people, each maintaining a different relationship through the same body. That distinction gave Paul an answer whenever Jennifer might reasonably accuse him of cheating. Paul loved Jennifer. Talos loved Marilee. If they were different people, he argued, then neither relationship violated the other. To be clear, Paul presented this as a mental health explanation. There is no need to diagnose a teenager from a distance, and there is no verified diagnosis in the material establishing that his claims were genuine. Later, when an investigator directly challenged the story during an interrogation, Paul dropped it rather than continuing to shift identities. That behavior gave investigators strong reason to view Talos as manipulation, not as evidence of a confirmed disorder. At the time, though, Jennifer and Marilee accepted it, and Paul did not stop with the claim that Talos was another personality. He built an entire history around him. Talos, Paul said, had once been a real physical person. He had lived during the 1700s and worked as an executioner. After his death, his soul had somehow become lodged inside the body of a 16-year-old boy in Texas. Think about how far that story had traveled. A second girlfriend had become a second identity. The second identity became the soul of a dead executioner. And that soul became part of a larger explanation for why all three teenagers belonged together. Paul told the girls that he believed in reincarnation. This relationship, he said, did not have to end with their current lives. If Jennifer, Marilee, and Paul remained together, if they spent their time together and refused to allow anyone to separate them, then they could be reborn together. They would share another life. Then perhaps another one after that. The promise turned an unstable teenage relationship into something that sounded permanent and cosmic. Staying together was no longer framed as a choice they were making in high school. Within their private logic, it determined whether they would find one another after death. Jennifer and Marilee did not remain rivals. They became close friends. Instead of questioning Paul's claims separately, the two girls helped reinforce a closed relationship in which those claims could survive. That closed system mattered. If Jennifer doubted Paul, Marilee was there to validate the arrangement. If Marilee felt insecure, Jennifer's participation made it seem legitimate. And if either girl objected to one of Paul's contradictions, he could invoke Talos and change the rules again. The sexual side of the relationship followed those same shifting rules. The three teenagers began having sex together. At times, Paul said he wanted to be with both girls as Paul, even though his own explanation held that Paul loved only Jennifer. At other times, he claimed Talos had emerged, meaning Marilee was supposedly the one he loved. At least once, according to the account later given, Paul said he had changed into Talos during sex with Jennifer. That created another argument because Marilee believed Talos was supposed to appear only for her. Under Paul's own rules, Talos had now cheated too. It was confusing because the framework was built to be confusing. Every contradiction produced another explanation. Every crossed boundary could be assigned to a different identity. Paul could claim exclusivity while maintaining two relationships, then alter which identity was responsible whenever the arrangement caused conflict. And the more complicated it became, the harder it was for anyone inside that relationship to step back and say the obvious thing. None of these rules made sense. From the outside, Susan could see that her daughter was disappearing into something unhealthy. She did not know every claim Paul had made. She did not know the full story about Talos, the executioner, the shifting identities, or the belief that the three teenagers could be reincarnated together. She did not need to know every detail to recognize that Paul had become a powerful influence over Jennifer, so Susan pushed harder. But inside the world the teenagers had constructed, parental concern did not register as concern. It became opposition. Adults were not protecting them. Adults were trying to destroy something they considered eternal. A curfew was no longer a household rule. It was interference. Being told to go home was not a normal limit. It threatened their future together, not only in Texas, but in whatever life they imagined would come next. Paul's Talos story gave the group a language for excusing contradictions and overriding ordinary boundaries. Within that closed system, staying together was no longer treated as a teenage preference. They believed it carried consequences beyond a single lifetime. That belief created a practical problem. Every parent still had the power to impose curfews, separate the teenagers, take away transportation, or involve the police. And the group began discussing a permanent way to remove all of them. The plan did not begin and end with Susan. The teenagers discussed killing Marilee's mother, Paul's father and stepmother, and Susan Bailey. Then they would take the adults' money, secure transportation, and flee north to Canada. That was the fantasy. Remove every parent who could interfere, collect whatever cash they could find, and start over somewhere beyond anyone's control. But the path from teenage resentment to a murder list was gradual. It began with something that, from the outside, looked more familiar. Jennifer started running away. Once Susan made it clear that she did not approve of Paul, and eventually forbade Jennifer from seeing him. Jennifer treated that boundary as something to get around, not accept. She believed she needed to spend as much time with Paul as possible. Inside the strange belief system the teenagers had built, separation was not merely frustrating. It supposedly threatened their chance to remain together in another life. So Jennifer would leave home and go to Paul's trailer. This was not a particularly effective escape. She and Paul did not have a hidden apartment or some private place where no adult would find them. Paul lived with his father, Paul Sr. And sooner or later, Paul Sr. would notice that an extra teenager was still inside his home late at night, or that Jennifer was there first thing in the morning because she had spent the night. When that happened, he did not simply let her stay. He would tell Jennifer to get into his car, drive her back to Susan's house, and make it clear that the arrangement could not continue. Whatever Paul Sr. thought of the relationship itself, he was not willing to turn his trailer into a place where Jennifer could disappear every time she fought with her mother. The teenagers tried the reverse arrangement too, and that was easier to conceal. Paul could visit the Bailey house while Susan was working. Her long retail shifts kept her away for hours, sometimes late into the evening. That gave Paul time to enter the house, stay with Jennifer, and leave before Susan returned. The same work schedule Susan maintained to support her family became the opening the teenagers used to deceive her. Think about the contradiction there. Jennifer resented Susan for being absent. Then she used Susan's absence, caused by the work that paid for their home, to secretly continue the relationship Susan had tried to stop. Even then, sneaking around was not enough. Jennifer and Paul were approaching adulthood. In ordinary circumstances, they could have waited. They could have finished school, found jobs, moved out, or simply left once they were legally able to make their own decisions. Those options might have been difficult and financially unstable, but they existed. The group wanted something more immediate. They wanted freedom without waiting for it. They wanted transportation without earning it. They wanted enough money to travel and begin a new life. Most of all, they wanted to remove every adult who might report them missing, take back a car, block access to money, or bring them home. Susan was the primary obstacle because she had explicitly forbidden Jennifer from seeing Paul. But the plan expanded far beyond her. Marilee's mother was placed on the list too. Before Marilee became involved with Paul and Jennifer, she and her mother had reportedly been close. Their relationship deteriorated as Marilee became more attached to the couple, and her mother began objecting to what was happening. Faced with a choice between the parent who had raised her and the two teenagers she believed she needed to remain with, Marilee aligned herself with Jennifer and Paul. Paul Sr.'s position was more complicated. He reportedly liked Jennifer. He knew his son struggled emotionally, and he believed Jennifer could sometimes keep Paul calmer and more grounded. He was not automatically opposed to her presence in Paul's life. What he opposed was the secrecy, the overnight stays, the running away, the repeated calls from Susan asking whether he knew where the teenagers were. He could see that the relationship had become surrounded by lies and escalating conflict, even if he did not know its most disturbing details. That was enough to make him an obstacle. Paul Sr. and Paul's stepmother were added to the proposed killings. Then the group recruited someone younger. David Bailey was approximately 14 years old. For much of his childhood, he had looked up to Jennifer. He followed her interests. Like his older sister, he enjoyed drawing, sketching, reading, and spending time with books. She had been the sibling he admired. Now she was helping draw him into a conspiracy to kill their mother. David had also begun arguing with Susan more frequently after the divorce. The available account does not establish one clean psychological explanation for that change. Maybe he was angry about the family breaking apart. Maybe he was responding to the pressure inside the home. Maybe it was ordinary adolescent conflict becoming entangled with something far more dangerous. We should be careful here. There is no need to invent a diagnosis or pretend one event explains everything. What matters is what David did. He agreed to participate. At that point, 4 teenagers were discussing a sequence of killings. Susan would die first. The other parents would follow. Afterward, the group would take money, obtain transportation, and head toward Canada. And their first idea for killing Susan sounds almost absurd, until you remember that they made preparations to try it. They planned to electrocute her in the bathtub. The idea was to take an electrical cord, cut or fray one end, and position it near the shower or bath. They believed Susan would enter, turn on the water, and receive a fatal shock before she understood what had happened. Then, after she was dead, they would hide the cord. According to their reasoning, first responders would find Susan's body in the bathtub, see no obvious electrical source, and conclude that she had suffered a heart attack. That tells you something about their judgment. They seemed to imagine that the absence of the cord would erase the physical evidence left on a body. They did not account for an autopsy, electrical injuries, the condition of the bathroom, or any serious examination of an unexpected death involving a healthy 43-year-old woman. And if the electrical cord failed, they had a backup plan. They discussed beating Susan to death, or beating her until she was unconscious, then placing her in the bathtub and using the electrical setup anyway. That plan was even harder to disguise. Bruising, cuts, broken bones, blunt force injuries. An autopsy would not confuse those with a spontaneous heart attack. Police would not walk into that bathroom, glance at the body, and close the case. But poor planning does not make the conduct harmless. The group was discussing methods. They were considering how to stage the death. They were thinking about what police might see and how evidence could be hidden. Their ideas were immature and chaotic, but they were no longer talking only about wishing Susan would disappear. Then came the chocolate pudding. Susan loved it, which made it useful. One night, Jennifer prepared a large batch and crushed medication into it. The hope was that Susan would eat enough to overdose. Susan took one bite. Immediately, she noticed something was wrong. The pudding tasted bitter or chemical, nothing like the food she expected. She asked Jennifer what had happened to it. Jennifer did not confess. She offered ordinary explanations. Maybe the milk had gone bad. Maybe she had made some mistake while preparing it. Maybe it would taste better later, after it had cooled. Susan stopped eating. The contaminated pudding was placed in the refrigerator, where it remained. That single bite may have saved her life that night. But Susan did not yet know she had survived an attempt to poison her. From her perspective, her daughter had made a bad dessert. There was no obvious reason to look at the bowl in the refrigerator and see evidence of a murder plot. And this is the point where the pattern matters more than the competence. The electrical plan was unlikely to work as intended. The idea of staging a beating as a heart attack made no forensic sense. The poisoning failed because the crushed medication ruined the taste. These were not criminal masterminds, but they did not respond to failure by abandoning the idea. They discussed it again. They changed methods. They kept the equipment. They moved from one proposed mechanism to another. Each failed attempt became a reason to revise the plan rather than a reason to stop. That is what establishes the danger. However confused their beliefs were, and however impractical their early methods seemed, the repeated planning showed that Susan's murder had moved beyond an angry fantasy. They had selected her as the first target. They had considered how to kill her, how to disguise it, what to take afterward, and where to run. Failure did not make Susan safer. It taught the group to abandon indirect methods and move toward an attack they could carry out themselves. And before Susan was killed, one mother woke to her bed shaking. Her daughter was standing over her with a knife, repeating that she was already late to join the others. On September 23rd, Marilee's mother survived an armed confrontation. David carried a knife to school, and Paul was being sought with his father's missing gun. Authorities saw 3 troubled teenagers. They did not see one connected conspiracy. The chain of warnings had begun 4 days earlier, on Friday, September 19th, 2008. Marilee went to the Bailey home after school without telling her mother. She stayed there Friday night, then remained away through Saturday and Sunday. For Marilee's mother, the disappearance was infuriating, but it did not initially look like an abduction. Marilee had run off before, usually to spend time with Jennifer and Paul. This had become a pattern. She would leave without permission, ignore the rules, then eventually turn up somewhere connected to the other 2 teenagers. So her mother did not immediately assume that a stranger had taken her or that she was in physical danger. She believed Marilee had chosen to disappear again. Still, she wanted her daughter home. Throughout the weekend, Marilee's mother used every free moment to drive through Roanoke and the surrounding towns. She searched street after street, concentrating on the places where Marilee, Jennifer, and Paul might gather. She was not waiting passively for her daughter to return. She was out looking for her. On Monday, the search finally worked. Marilee's mother spotted her walking through Jennifer's neighborhood. She pulled over and ordered her into the car. At first, she was angry. Marilee had vanished for an entire weekend without permission or explanation. But once Marilee was inside, that anger gave way to concern. Something was clearly wrong. Marilee was crying. She began talking about Paul, reincarnation, and the need to join the others. She said there was a plan. She said it would be difficult, but she had to complete it so that she could be with Paul in another life. Now think about how that would have sounded without the context we have. Her mother did not know about the full murder list. She did not know the teenagers had discussed killing their parents and escaping to Canada. She did not know Paul had persuaded Marilee and Jennifer that staying together in this life would somehow bind them together in the next one. She heard her 14-year-old daughter talking through tears about reincarnation, another life, and a mysterious plan. It sounded incoherent because much of the belief system itself was incoherent. Marilee's mother understood that her daughter was deeply upset. What she did not understand was that Marilee was effectively revealing pieces of a conspiracy. That evening, Marilee kept crying. She cried through dinner. She cried as the night went on. Even after she went into her bedroom, the sobbing continued loudly enough for her mother to hear it through the walls. Eventually, the house became quiet enough for her mother to fall asleep. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, September 23rd, her bed began to move. It was not an alarm. Someone was beside the bed, shaking it or bumping against it. Marilee's mother opened her eyes. Her daughter was standing there with a knife. She had only a moment to react. She moved away from Marilee, got off the opposite side of the bed, grabbed her cell phone, and called 911. And during that call, she was trying to do two things at once: protect herself from the knife and understand what her own daughter intended to do. She ordered Marilee to put the weapon down. She demanded to know what Marilee thought she was doing. Marilee, meanwhile, wanted the phone. She wanted the car. She repeatedly said that she had to leave and go with the others. The plan had been disrupted. She was late. "We were all supposed to go," she told her mother. "You ruined it." There was a struggle, and the emergency operator could hear it happening over the open line. Marilee's mother managed to take the knife away from her. She then told the operator that the immediate danger had passed, but she still needed officers at the house. Marilee was arrested. The initial charge was aggravated robbery, apparently because she had used a weapon while attempting to take her mother's phone and car. That charge focused on what Marilee had demanded during the confrontation. It did not capture the larger question hanging over the scene. Why did she need the car so badly? And who were the people she believed were waiting for her? The charge was later changed to aggravated assault. During questioning, Marilee continued using the same strange, urgent language. She talked about Canada. She said she needed to go. She said she was late. She referred again to the plan. But investigators did not yet identify Jennifer, Paul, and David as members of a coordinated plot. Marilee's attack was treated as a violent confrontation between a troubled teenager and her mother. And while Marilee was trying to get away, Paul had his own plan in motion. At some point around this period, Paul took his father's gun. He intended to wait inside the family trailer until Paul Sr. and his wife came home from work. The plan was direct. When they walked through the door, Paul would shoot them. There was no elaborate trap. He would sit there with the gun and wait. What stopped him was not a change of heart. It was a spontaneous date night. Paul Sr. and his wife decided to meet at a restaurant instead of going directly home. After dinner, they went to see a movie. The decision kept them away from the trailer for hours beyond the time they would normally have returned. They did not call Paul to tell him they would be late, so he waited and waited. Eventually, he became tired of sitting there. He put the gun away and abandoned the attempt. Paul Sr. and his wife came home later without knowing what had been waiting for them. As far as they understood, they had gone out for dinner and a movie. They had no idea that the unplanned evening may have saved both of their lives. Now come back to September 23rd, because the warnings were still stacking up. That same day, David Bailey brought a knife to school. He did not attack anyone with it, and he was not trying very hard to conceal it. He openly showed the weapon to friends. Another student alerted a teacher, and the school responded by suspending David for 3 days. Viewed on its own, it could be handled as a school disciplinary incident. A 13-year-old brought a prohibited weapon onto campus, displayed it, and was removed from school. But it was not happening on its own. That day, Marilee had confronted her mother with a knife. David had carried another knife into school, and Paul had disappeared while his father's gun was missing. Paul had already been gone for several days by the time Paul Sr. contacted police. His absences were not entirely unusual. Paul had a habit of vanishing, spending time with Jennifer, then turning up again. At first, his father had not treated this disappearance as an emergency, but too many days had passed. More importantly, Paul Sr. had discovered that his gun was gone, and he suspected his son had taken it, so he reported Paul missing. Even then, the cases remained separate. Marilee appeared to have attacked her mother during an emotional family conflict. David's knife was a matter for school officials. Paul looked like a runaway who might have stolen a firearm. Each explanation was plausible enough when isolated from the others. That was the problem. On the morning of Wednesday, September 24th, officers went to Susan Bailey's house looking for Paul. It was not yet 9 o'clock, and Susan was still home. She appeared surprised by the suggestion that Paul might be inside. Jennifer also denied that he was there. Neither gave the officers consent to search the house, so the officers left. It is possible Susan genuinely did not know he was hiding there. She worked long hours, and the teenagers had become practiced at moving Paul in and out of the house around her schedule. Later that evening, officers returned. This time, Paul panicked and ran from the house. An officer saw him flee, but Paul got away before he could be caught. The denial from that morning could no longer be taken at face value. An investigator went inside, and Susan confronted Jennifer. "I knew something was up," she told her. "You've had it so easy. You have all the freedom you want. I don't know what the hell is going on." Susan believed Jennifer and Paul might be preparing to run away again. She threatened to send Jennifer to relatives, either her grandparents in California or her father in Minnesota. And then she drew a line. No lying, no more. But the problem inside that house had moved far beyond lying about a boyfriend. There were packed suitcases ready to go. Susan saw luggage she had not known about, including a case or bag containing knives. Officers encountered additional large knives in the house. Paul's wallet was there too, confirming that he had not merely stopped by for a brief visit. Then there were the voicemail messages. Marilee's mother had been calling Jennifer, trying to understand what had happened during the knife confrontation. Jennifer had not returned those calls. Officers played the messages, and Susan heard that Marilee had attacked her mother. Now the separate pieces began connecting for Susan. Paul had been hiding inside her home. Suitcases had been packed. Knives had been gathered. Marilee had confronted her own mother with another knife. Jennifer had been acting strangely and staying awake through the night. And then Susan remembered the pudding. Jennifer had made it for her earlier. Susan loved chocolate pudding, but this batch had tasted so awful that she stopped after one bite. At the time, Jennifer had offered an ordinary explanation. Perhaps the milk was bad. Perhaps something had gone wrong while she made it. Standing in a house filled with packed bags, weapons, and evidence of deception, Susan reconsidered that explanation. She told the officers she believed Jennifer might have tried to poison her. That should have changed the entire shape of the situation. This was no longer simply a mother disapproving of her daughter's boyfriend. Susan was describing a possible attempt on her life, surrounded by preparations to leave and multiple weapons. But the officers had arrived with a narrower objective. They were looking for Paul and for the gun missing from his father's home. Paul had escaped, and the gun was not immediately found. The suspected poisoning, Marilee's attack, David's knife, Paul's firearm, the packed suitcases, and the teenagers' repeated references to leaving remained fragments of different incidents. By the end of September 24th, Susan understood that she was facing something more dangerous than a forbidden romance. Police had seen enough fragments to suggest a larger threat. No one assembled them into a single picture. 2 nights later, Susan came home from a closing shift at Bed Bath & Beyond. Inside the house, the landlines had been unplugged, and the teenagers were waiting. Susan was still wearing her Bed Bath & Beyond name tag when she died. That small detail would help investigators place her final hours and expose how carefully the attack had been prepared. September 25th, 2008 was a Thursday. Susan worked the closing shift, which kept her away from home until close to midnight. Investigators would later conclude that she was killed late that night, or shortly after midnight on September 26th. She had come home dressed for work, with the name tag still pinned to her shirt. She had no idea what was waiting inside. Paul had secretly remained in the Bailey house for several days. He had already run from police there, but instead of staying away, he had returned or continued hiding inside. Susan worked long hours, and the teenagers used that absence against her. Paul could stay in Jennifer's room, move through the house while Susan was gone, then disappear from view before she came home. That arrangement required Jennifer's help. It also meant the attack was not the spontaneous result of a late-night argument. The preparation had started before Susan ever walked through the door. While she was at work, the household landlines were unplugged. Think about what that means. Someone had gone from room to room and deliberately disconnected the phones, so Susan could not easily call 911 once the attack began. This was 2008, when a home phone could still be the fastest and most dependable way to reach emergency services. The teenagers were not merely talking about killing her anymore. They were preparing the house itself. Exactly what happened after Susan came home remains disputed because the people responsible gave different accounts, and those accounts changed whenever responsibility became inconvenient. Paul later claimed Jennifer was the person who set the attack in motion. According to him, she led Susan toward the top of the stairs, where he and David were waiting. Then, he said, all three attacked Susan with knives. It was an account that placed Jennifer at the center of the plan, but Paul had every reason to shift as much blame as possible onto her. Jennifer did the same thing in reverse. Her first version was that the murder plot had never been serious. Yes, she admitted discussing it, but she claimed she believed the entire thing was some kind of dark joke. Then, according to Jennifer, David suddenly began stabbing Susan. Jennifer said she was so shocked that she initially froze. When she tried to call 911, she claimed Paul stopped her. There were obvious problems with that story. The phones had already been disconnected. Paul had been hidden inside the house. Luggage had been prepared. Earlier attempts had already been made on Susan's life, including the poisoned chocolate pudding. Those were not the actions of someone who thought the plan was a joke. Jennifer eventually offered another version. This time, she admitted that she knew Susan was going to be killed and that she had helped prepare for it. She said Susan's late shift gave them time to get ready. Because it ran so late, David may initially have gone to sleep. Paul was also in Jennifer's room, apparently sleeping or waiting there until Susan returned. Jennifer said she stayed awake. When Susan came home, Jennifer woke Paul, but she still denied taking part in the physical attack. In this version, Paul killed Susan while Jennifer sat nearby and watched. So there are at least 3 competing stories. Paul said Jennifer brought Susan upstairs and all 3 participated. Jennifer first blamed David and claimed she tried to get help. Later, she admitted knowingly preparing for the murder but blamed Paul for carrying it out. Investigators did not accept any one of those stories as complete. The physical evidence suggested Susan had been attacked by more than one person. She had been beaten, stabbed 26 times, and suffered a fatal cut to her throat. Investigators believed knives and a wooden bat were used. The wounds varied enough in their placement and character that the medical evidence pointed toward multiple attackers. Not simply one person striking repeatedly with one weapon. Their reconstruction was horrifying but important. Investigators believed Susan was surrounded and attacked from different positions. They believed the teenagers took turns striking and stabbing her, using more than one knife as well as the bat. Who inflicted each individual wound could not be established with certainty, and the defendants continued disputing that question. But investigators believed the total pattern could not reasonably be attributed to Paul alone. David's possible decision to sleep while Susan finished her shift did not remove him from that reconstruction. At most, it explained where he may have been during part of the waiting. It did not account for the physical evidence, Paul's statement, or what happened after Susan entered the house. And whatever precise sequence unfolded upstairs, Susan never had a meaningful chance to summon help. The phones had been unplugged before she arrived. The people waiting for her knew her schedule. They knew she would be tired after closing the store. They had weapons available throughout the house. This was an ambush built around the routine Susan followed to provide for them. After she died, the teenagers made an attempt to clean the scene. Attempt is the key word. Blood remained on the floors and walls. Fingerprints were left in it. The violence had spread evidence through the house, and the cleanup was nowhere close to thorough enough to conceal what had happened. Chemical cleaner was poured over Susan's body and applied to other items, apparently in an effort to destroy fingerprints, DNA, or both. The cell phones received similar treatment. They were placed in bathtub water with cleaning chemicals, as though soaking them might erase the information stored inside or remove every physical trace from their surfaces. It was a crude attempt to abandon the devices while making them less useful to police. And hanging near that same bathtub was the electrical cord from one of the earlier plans to kill Susan. The cord had been cut and arranged near the water, but the fatal attack had occurred elsewhere. That abandoned setup remained exactly where it had been left. Another piece of evidence showing that the teenagers had considered more than one method before settling on direct violence. Investigators later determined that the cord, as arranged, probably could not have delivered a fatal shock. It might have injured Susan. It might have frightened her. But it was unlikely to kill her in the way the teenagers apparently imagined. That finding says something about this entire crime. The group planned obsessively, but they did not understand what they were doing. They thought about poisoning, electrocution, weapons, escape routes, and destroying evidence. Yet almost every stage of the plan exposed them further. David even rode his bicycle to Walmart to purchase cleaning supplies. That trip created 2 more pieces of evidence, a receipt and surveillance footage. The store's cameras documented him arriving by bicycle, buying the supplies, and leaving. Instead of separating the cleanup from the people inside the house, the purchase helped tie David directly to what happened afterward. Paul made his own attempt to avoid recognition. He cut his hair before leaving, apparently hoping a different appearance would make him harder to identify. But the scissors remained inside the house. So did the pile of hair. That is the contrast at the center of this case. They were organized enough to prepare luggage, disconnect the phones, buy cleaning products, damage their cell phones, alter Paul's appearance, take Susan's car, and begin an escape. But they left nearly everything investigators would need behind. Weapons remained scattered through the house. Knives had not been removed. The wooden bat was still there. Paul's father's missing gun was hidden in the attic. The poisoned pudding remained in the refrigerator. The electrical cord still hung near the bathtub. There were bloody fingerprints, chemical residue, discarded phones, Walmart records, scissors, and Paul's freshly cut hair. Preparation was everywhere. So was panic. After the attack, Jennifer, David, and Paul took Susan's car and the small amount of money they could find. They abandoned their phones and began driving north. Investigators believed they were following the larger plan the group had discussed: reach Canada, escape parental control, and begin a new life together. But Susan's death was no longer something they could explain away as a plan that had gone too far. The disconnected phones, earlier poisoning, packed luggage, cleaning supplies, and coordinated flight established a progression. First came resentment, then discussion, then failed attempts, then preparation, and finally, execution. The killers were now on the road, but Susan had not yet been found. For 3 days, the locked front door and her missing car allowed the house, and everything inside it, to remain untouched. Susan never missed work. But when she failed to appear for her Bed Bath & Beyond shift on September 26th, the first explanation police accepted was that she had taken an unannounced trip with her children. Her manager knew that did not fit. Retail schedules can be chaotic. Employees call in sick. Shifts get confused. People occasionally fail to show up. Susan was not one of those people. She was dependable, and she needed the hours. She had spent years working long shifts to support Jennifer and David. Simply abandoning a scheduled day without calling was completely out of character. So when Susan did not arrive, her manager tried to reach her. No answer. He called again, but still could not get through. At that point, this stopped looking like a scheduling mistake. Susan had not called to say she was sick. She had not asked anyone to cover for her. She had simply disappeared from a job where people expected her to be. Her manager pulled up Susan's emergency contact and called her mother, Kate. That conversation immediately made the situation more troubling. Kate had not heard from Susan either. Now think about the chain forming here. Susan misses work. Her manager cannot reach her. Her mother cannot reach her. And when Kate starts trying every number she has, no one in the Bailey family answers. She called Jennifer. Nothing. She called David. Nothing. She tried their cell phones and then the landline inside the house. The home phone rang and rang, but nobody picked up. For Kate, there was no comforting explanation. She knew her daughter. Susan might work late. She might be exhausted. She might become distracted by some crisis involving the children. But she would not knowingly leave her manager waiting without a word. She would not walk away from a shift she depended on and ignore every call from work and family. Kate had the kind of certainty that is difficult to put into a police report. There was no broken window she could point to. No witness had seen an attack. She could only say, "This is not my daughter." And sometimes, that is the first real alarm. Kate contacted police and requested a welfare check at Susan's home in Roanoke. When officers arrived, they examined the property from the outside. The front door was closed and locked. They knocked, but no one responded. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. No shattered glass. No damaged lock. Nothing visible from the exterior suggested that someone had broken into the house. The porch light was still on. Susan's car was not in the driveway. That missing car gave officers an explanation that appeared ordinary enough. Perhaps Susan had taken Jennifer and David somewhere. Maybe it was a last-minute family trip. Maybe they had left town and failed to tell Susan's manager or Kate. Families do sometimes change plans without notifying everyone. Teenagers do not always answer their phones. An empty driveway in a quiet, locked house can mean something terrible, but they can also mean nobody is home. The officers did not know Susan personally. They did not know how fiercely dependable she was at work. To them, her absence was concerning, but the exterior of the house did not present a clear emergency. That distinction mattered. A welfare check does not automatically give police permission to force their way into a locked home. Officers generally need some specific reason to believe that someone inside is in immediate danger. From where they stood, they had unanswered calls and a worried mother. They did not have a cry for help, visible blood, a damaged entrance, or a person seen lying unconscious through a window, so they stayed outside. They reported back that the family appeared to be away, possibly traveling together. The missing car seemed to support that theory. Kate did not accept it. Susan would have told her employer. She would have called her mother. Even if Jennifer and David ignored their phones, Susan would not ignore everyone. Kate kept dialing throughout the rest of the day and into the night, trying the same numbers over and over, hoping that one of those calls would finally be answered. None of them were. By the next morning, Kate's concern had only deepened. She requested a second welfare check. Police returned to the Bailey house, and the second visit ended much like the first. The door remained locked. Nobody came when they knocked. There was still no obvious evidence of a break-in or some visible emergency inside. Once again, officers remained outside. And here's the part that gets me. Taken alone, that decision can be explained. But almost nothing about this situation truly existed alone. Different officers and agencies already possessed pieces of the same threat. Paul had been reported missing after his father discovered that a gun was gone. Police had tracked Paul to Susan's address. During their second visit there, officers had watched him run from the property. David had brought a knife to school and received a 3-day suspension. Marilee had stood over her sleeping mother with a knife and talked about needing a car so she could leave with the others. She had repeated that there was a plan and that she was late. Inside Susan's house, police had previously seen packed luggage. One suitcase Susan did not recognize contained knives. Other large knives were sitting around the home. Paul's wallet had been found there, even after he fled. Susan herself had begun to suspect that the terrible-tasting pudding Jennifer made for her had been poisoned. Those were not rumors discovered weeks later. They were warnings that existed before Susan was reported missing, but they sat in separate boxes. A runaway report, a school weapons incident, an assault by a different teenager against a different mother, a missing gun, a suspicious bag, a possible poisoning that had not been investigated, 2 welfare checks at a locked house. No one had yet pulled all of it into one immediate threat assessment centered on Susan. That is the through line in this case, isn't it? 4 teenagers had discussed killing their parents, but the adults around them saw individual acts of rebellion, mental instability, or family conflict. Even after those acts escalated into weapons and attempted violence, the full conspiracy remained hidden in the gaps between separate incidents. For several days, the Bailey house remained closed. Then, roughly 750 miles away, 3 teenagers ran out of money. At approximately 3:30 in the morning on September 29th, officers in South Dakota encountered Jennifer Bailey, David Bailey, and Paul Henson. They had made it a remarkable distance from Roanoke, but their escape plan was already falling apart. They had taken money from Susan, but not enough to sustain a trip to Canada. By the time they reached South Dakota, most of it was gone. They could not even afford enough gasoline to keep driving, so they tried to steal it. That attempted theft brought police directly to them before the South Dakota officers knew anything about Susan, the unanswered phone calls, or the silent house in Texas. The gasoline was not their only problem. The town had a youth curfew, and all 3 were still minors. Jennifer was only days away from turning 18, but legally, she had not reached it yet. 3 underage teenagers out around 3:30 in the morning were already going to attract attention. At first, the situation could still be read as a runaway case. Maybe they were joyriding. Maybe they had taken a parent's car without permission and driven much farther than intended. It was serious, but not necessarily evidence of murder. Then officers checked the vehicle registration. The car was from Texas, and it belonged to Susan Bailey. That changed the tone immediately. 3 minors from Texas were stranded in South Dakota in the middle of the night, attempting to steal gasoline while driving a vehicle registered to an adult who was nowhere to be found. South Dakota authorities contacted police in Roanoke. The question was simple. Why did these 3 teenagers have Susan Bailey's car? Back in Texas, that call finally connected facts that had remained separated. Susan had missed work. Her mother could not reach her. Officers had conducted 2 unresolved welfare checks at her home. Her car had been absent from the driveway. Now that car had turned up roughly 750 miles away with Jennifer, David, and Paul inside it. The possibility of an innocent family trip was gone. Susan was not traveling with her children. Her children had left Texas without her, and whatever they were running from, or toward. Their plan to reach Canada had collapsed at a South Dakota gas station. A failed attempt to steal gasoline had done what the knives, the missing gun, Paul's flight, Marilee's attack, Susan's poisoning suspicion, and 2 worried calls from Kate had not. It connected the missing teenagers, Susan's absent vehicle, and the locked, silent house. Roanoke officers could no longer stand on the porch and assume that nobody was home. This time, they went inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, they smelled decomposition mixed with cleaning chemicals. Then they began finding a different potential murder weapon in nearly every part of the house. Investigators did not have to search for one hidden clue. They had to move through a house where almost every room contained another piece of the murder plan. And the first thing that greeted them was the smell. It hit before anyone saw anything. It was that unmistakable combination of a rotting body layered underneath cleaning supplies, like somebody had died there, and then somebody else had come along afterward and done a very half-hearted, half-baked job trying to cover it up. That odor alone told the officers everything they needed to know about the theory they had been clinging to for days. Nobody had gone on a spontaneous little family road trip. There was no unannounced vacation. Something terrible had happened inside these walls, and it had happened long enough ago that the house itself was starting to tell on the people who lived there. Then they saw the blood. And I don't mean a little bit. The house was completely full of it. It was splattered across the walls. It was on the floors. It had soaked down into surfaces you would never expect. This was not a scene where someone had died quietly and neatly. This was chaos everywhere you looked, and the more the officers moved through the home, the worse it got. When they reached the bathroom, they found exactly what the teenagers had described in that first electrocution plan, except it hadn't gone the way anyone intended. That frayed electrical cord we talked about earlier was there, dangling right over the tub, set up almost like it was waiting for someone to climb in. But there was nobody in the water. Instead, the tub held a strange collection of things: water, a single knife, and cell phones sitting down at the bottom of it. Presumably, somebody had tried to throw those phones into the water to wipe out whatever data was on them: texts, call logs, anything that might tie the whole conspiracy together. And it wasn't just water. The phones were coated in some kind of chemical cleaner, so strong that the police could still smell it even after the devices had been pulled out from underneath the surface. Reading between the lines, it looks an awful lot like whoever did this was trying to destroy the data on those phones and scrub away any fingerprints or biological evidence at the same time. Here's the thing though. It didn't work. None of it worked. And that becomes the running theme of this entire scene. Because when the police actually examined that electrical cord, the type of cord it was, the way it had been rigged up over the tub, they realized there was no way it could have ever killed Susan. It might have hurt her. It might have given her an uncomfortable jolt. But it simply wasn't powerful enough to deliver a fatal shock. The centerpiece of their original plan was never going to do the job in the first place. And that incompetence was stamped all over this house. When I told you these kids were not exactly criminal masterminds, I want you to understand just how literal I was being. Because besides that useless cord, there were weapons absolutely everywhere. There was a wooden bat sitting in one room. There were knives scattered throughout the place, in multiple rooms, including one that had been tucked right down into the cushions of the couch, like it was there for whoever needed to grab it fast. Everywhere you turned, there was something that could kill you, or something that could convict you. A weapon here, a piece of evidence there, a clue in the next room. It was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a house of horrors. And then there was the pudding. Remember the chocolate pudding? That big pot Jennifer made? The one she crushed all those pills into? The one Susan took a single bite of and pushed away because it tasted so awful? It was still sitting right there in the refrigerator. So now, standing in that kitchen, the police were looking at physical proof of the very thing Susan had already started to suspect on her own. She'd been poisoned, and she'd been telling people she thought she'd been poisoned, and here was the evidence chilling in the fridge the entire time. And remember that gun? The one Paul's father had noticed was missing? The one Paul had stolen to shoot his dad and stepmom the night they unknowingly saved their own lives by going on a date? The police didn't spot it right away, but eventually they found it too. It had been stashed up in the attic. Then there was the detail that genuinely stops you cold, because it's just so strange. In the middle of all of this, the officers came across a pile of cut hair and a pair of scissors. Human hair, just sitting in a heap. It would later be identified as Paul's. And the theory the police landed on was that Paul had cut off his own hair to change his appearance, to make himself harder to recognize before the three of them ran. When you put it next to everything else, it fits. Dump the phones, pour chemicals on the evidence, alter your face, and disappear. And then, finally, they went upstairs. They turned down a hallway. And that is where they found Susan. She was face down on the floor of her own home. Her throat had been slit, and she had been stabbed a total of 26 times. She was still wearing her clothes from work. That Bed Bath and Beyond name tag still pinned to her shirt, exactly the way it had been when she walked in the door after her closing shift. She had clearly been dead for days, and her body showed it. During all that time, her blood had soaked completely through her clothing, so thoroughly that it had turned the fabric black. That is how much blood she lost. It had bled down into the carpet underneath her, saturating it. And whoever killed her had poured that same chemical cleaner over her body, the same stuff that was on the phones. One more piece of a cleanup effort that was as thorough in intent as it was useless in execution, because their fingerprints were still in the blood all over the house. They hadn't gotten rid of the weapons. They hadn't gotten rid of anything that mattered, but they had, at least, tried. And that's really the point. This crime scene didn't hand investigators one single smoking gun. It handed them a stack of them. Poison in the fridge. A jury-rigged electrical trap over the tub. Weapons in nearly every room. Suitcases packed and ready to go, including one full of knives Susan had never seen before. Landlines disconnected so no one could call for help. Chemicals and receipts from the cleanup. And on top of all of that, the flight itself. Everything about this house told the same story, and it was a story of premeditation. Not a moment of rage, but an idea that had been developing for a long time. The evidence even filled in what happened after the killing. Along with those bloody fingerprints, the detectives found a Walmart receipt, and Walmart's own security cameras showed David biking over to the store, buying up a load of supplies, and heading back. All within the past few days. The cleanup wasn't spontaneous either. It was shopped for. Which brings us to the part that makes this whole scene so surreal. While the Roanoke police were still cataloging all of this, the killers were already in custody. Officers 750 miles away, in South Dakota, had detained Jennifer, David, and Paul. Not for murder, because nobody there knew about a murder yet, but for trying to steal gas after their getaway money ran dry. Once Roanoke connected Susan's body to that stolen car, the message went back out, and the teenager's status changed instantly. They were no longer runaway minors picked up past curfew. They were murder suspects held without bail. And inside the Bailey house, the police had also found something that opened up an entirely new thread. Marilee's belongings, including her school ID, sitting there among the wreckage. Now, the police already knew Marilee couldn't have been part of the actual attack on Susan. She had been locked up since September 23rd after standing over her own mother with a knife. And Susan wasn't killed until roughly 2.5 days later. Still in her work uniform, name tag pinned on. The timeline made it impossible. But finding Marilee's things scattered inside a home where another mother had just been stabbed to death by her own daughter and that daughter's boyfriend, that was too much of a coincidence to walk past. One girl tries to stab her mom, and her ID turns up in the house where a nearly identical murder was carried out. So they questioned her. And Marilee folded. She told them everything. She couldn't speak to Susan's murder itself because she hadn't been there for it, but she laid out the rest. The throuple with Jennifer and Paul, the Talos story, and the reincarnation fantasy, the conversations about killing all of their parents, and the plan to take the money and flee to Canada, which is almost certainly where the other three were headed when South Dakota stopped them. Because she cooperated so fully, prosecutors only charged Marilee with the aggravated assault on her own mother, rather than as a participant in the murder that actually happened. So by the time the police finished walking through that house, one thing was beyond argument. This was not a random home invasion. There was no stranger, no burglary gone wrong. This was an extended, premeditated family murder conspiracy, and the evidence in every room proved it. But here's what the house couldn't tell them. It could answer who had prepared for Susan's death, and how long the idea had been simmering. It could not answer the one question everybody would end up fighting over. Once Susan actually walked through that door, which teenager did what? And that question followed all three defendants straight into court. Each one of them had a way to shave time off their own sentence by confessing. The problem was that every single confession told a different version of Susan's final minutes. Jennifer Bailey admitted that she helped plan her mother's death. And then, in the same breath, she insisted the plan had been a joke. Paul Henson admitted he was there, but said the whole thing was Jennifer's idea from the start, that she had manipulated him into it. And the physical evidence sitting in that house, the blood on the walls, the wounds on Susan's body, suggested that neither one of them was telling the whole story. That's really the heart of what happened after the arrests. Nobody ever gave one clean, honest, complete account of the night Susan died. Everybody had a version. Everybody's version conveniently handed the knife to somebody else. And because of that, plea agreements ended up being the center of this entire case. Think about the position the prosecutors were in. All three defendants were juveniles. Jennifer was 17, just about a week short of her 18th birthday. Paul was 16. David was 14. The physical evidence made it obvious that this had been a group effort, a collective preparation, weeks in the making, with multiple failed attempts before the fatal night. But when it came down to who did what, who delivered which wound, that stayed disputed. Every single one of them pointed at the other two. So rather than gamble on three separate trials where each kid blamed the others and a jury might struggle to sort it out, the state leaned on plea deals to lock in convictions and lock in prison time. Let's start with David, because David was the youngest and, in some ways, the simplest resolution. David pled guilty to murder, and because he was only 14 years old, he was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Now, do that math with me? 26 years. He's going to be released in 2034, and when he walks out, he'll be roughly 40 years old. That still gets me. You can take part in murdering your own mother, serve out the entire sentence, and still have half your life left ahead of you, free, at 40. It's a wild thing to sit with. Then there was Paul. Paul agreed to a plea bargain too. He admitted he was guilty of murder, and he received a 60-year sentence. Now, here's the context on that. The maximum sentence for a minor who commits murder in Texas is life without parole. Paul avoided that. By taking the deal, he got 60 years with eligibility for parole after serving 30, which, honestly, is a fairly generous outcome given what he did. 30 years and he gets a parole hearing, which puts him back in the world not too long after David gets out. Now, once Paul's sentence was finalized, the investigators wanted something more than a signature on a plea. They wanted the full story. So they gave Paul a chance to sit down and give a complete account, the how and the why of Susan's death. And their logic here makes sense. The charges were settled. The sentence was locked in. There was no reason left for him to lie, no advantage left to protect. So they pulled him into an interrogation room to hear it. Daparas. And right away, Paul reached back for the old crutch. He started sliding into the personality disorder story again, the multiple personalities, the whole framework he'd used from the very beginning. He started to bring Talos back into the room. But this time, the detective wasn't having any of it. He shut it down immediately. No, don't even start that with me. He refused to engage with Talos at all, wouldn't play along, wouldn't treat that persona like it was a real thing sitting across the table. And here's the part that tells you everything. The moment Paul got called out, he dropped it. He stopped. There was no struggle, no episode, no other voice taking over. He simply continued the interview as Paul and stayed Paul for the rest of it, which, to investigators and honestly to anyone paying attention, confirmed what they'd already suspected. Talos had never been a real, independently established identity. Talos had been a story, a manipulative, useful story that Paul could switch on and off whenever it served him and switch off the instant it stopped working. So what did Paul actually say once he was just Paul? He told them it was all Jennifer's idea. He said Jennifer had wanted her mother dead, and that she had played him, manipulated him, worked him into being the one to do it for her. And on the night of the murder, he said Jennifer was the one who led Susan up to the top of the stairs, where he and David were waiting. And then, according to Paul, all three of them attacked her with knives together. Now hold that version in your head, because Jennifer's version was going to look very different. Sued, Jennifer's sentencing hearing came on October 15th, 2009. And here's the thing about her plea deal. It didn't just require her to admit guilt. It required her to explain it, to give the full account of how and why she did it, the same thing Paul had been asked for. But when Jennifer got up there, she didn't want to explain anything, because in her telling, she hadn't really done anything wrong. Her first courtroom version went like this. Yes, she'd talked about the plan, but she said she thought it was a joke. She never took it seriously, never believed anybody was actually going to go through with it. And then she turned on her 14-year-old brother. She claimed David was the one who started the stabbing. She said she was too shocked, too stunned to move. And she said that when she tried to call 911 to save her mother, Paul physically stopped her from reaching the phone. The judge did not buy it. And he told her plainly that if she wanted the benefit of that plea agreement, the reduced exposure that came with it, she had to give a truthful and complete account. Not a version where she's an innocent bystander who tried to call for help. The truth. So she took a few days to think about it. And when she came back to court the following week, the story changed. This time, Jennifer admitted she knowingly participated in the preparation. She admitted Paul had been staying at the house for days without Susan knowing. She admitted that while Susan was out working her long closing shift, they had unplugged every landline in the house so that Susan wouldn't be able to call for help once the attack started. That's not a joke. That's a plan. But even in this truer version, Jennifer drew one line she would not cross. She still insisted that Paul alone stabbed Susan and that she just sat there and watched. And that's where her account collided head-on with the evidence. Because the medical examiner looked at Susan's wounds and saw something Jennifer's story couldn't explain. The differences among the stab wounds indicated more than one attacker and more than one weapon. This wasn't one person. Combine that with the wooden bat found at the scene, and investigators reconstructed it as all three of them, Jennifer, David, and Paul, taking part in the attack, stabbing and beating Susan, standing around her until she was dead. No single defendant ever accepted that complete reconstruction. Each one kept some piece of distance. But the physical evidence didn't care who confessed to what. The court accepted Jennifer's plea anyway, and she received the exact same sentence as Paul, 60 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 30. And then there's Marilee, whose path ended somewhere completely different. Because Marilee cooperated, because she folded and told investigators everything about the throuple, about the reincarnation beliefs, about the whole plan to run to Canada, she was never charged in connection with Susan's death. She got 5 years of probation for the assault on her own mother. That's it. 5 years probation. Jennifer, Paul, and David all remained in prison. And here's what still lingers over all of it. Even after Jennifer gave that confession in open court, she later went right back to claiming she was innocent, saying it wasn't fair that she was convicted when Paul and David were the ones who did the physical attack. Nobody close to the case believed her. Susan's own parents, Jennifer's own grandparents, said publicly, more than once, that they thought she was lying about her role. And, like a lot of people do after a conviction, Jennifer has said she found faith, that she's a different person now. I'll just leave that where it is, without telling you what to make of it. But I don't want to end this on any of them, because they've taken up enough of the story. I want to end on Susan. When she died, she was still wearing her clothes from work. Her Bed Bath & Beyond name tag was still pinned to her shirt. Her last ordinary act on this earth was finishing another long closing shift, another night of the endless hours she worked to support that household, the very same house where her children and her daughter's boyfriend had spent weeks preparing to kill her. So the courts settled the legal questions. 3 guilty parties, 3 sentences. But the plea deals never produced one uncontested account of that night, and they never answered the human ones. Whether any of them, now grown, truly understands what they took from her. Whether Jennifer and Paul are still in contact, still believing they'll be reincarnated together. Or whether each of them still survives, to this day, by handing the final act to someone else. So tell me in the comments. Out of all those warnings, the confrontation, the knife at school, the missing gun, the poisoned pudding, which one should have changed the outcome? Let me know what you think. And subscribe, because I'll be back with another one very soon. Until then, stay safe. Bye.